welcome to Real Women. I'm Sarah Heaton, Director of Programs for Endow, and I'm joined today by Emily Sullivan. Today we're going to be talking about a 19th century saint, Edith Stein. She's recently become one of my favorite saints, and I'm excited to be talking about her with you today, Emily. So tell us a little bit about what first got you interested in Edith Stein and a little bit about her story.
Yeah, so I think many Catholics have this experience of being stalked by particular saints, you know? Like our Lord will say, it's not you who chose me, but I who chose you. And I think I have that relationship with a few saints, and Edith Stein's certainly one of them. When I was in 8th grade and preparing for confirmation, we had to do a report on a saint, and nothing was really coming to me, and all the other big name saints, the little flower, had already been chosen. And I was telling my mother as the deadline for this report was approaching, I don't know who I'm going to write on. And she said, well, John Paul just canonized a new one just the other day. Why don't you go find out about her? My New York mother. Why don't you go find out about her? So this is before Google, had to go and find an actual article about Edith Stein. And I found her so compelling. She had died in 1942 in Auschwitz, so not that long ago as compared to so many saints, you know, we think of coming from ancient times, but she was a relatively modern saint. And this was 1998 in October. John Paul had just canonized her in Rome. And her search for truth was so interesting. In 8th grade, I didn't yet know what philosophy was or the study of philosophy. But what was very clear to me was that she was eager for the truth, and she was constantly, she was raised in the Jewish faith. She was born to Jewish parents in October 12th, 1891. So her father dies very suddenly when she's 2, and her mother, Augusta, has to run the family business, so to speak. So she's a full-time working mother running the family's lumber business. And her older siblings really realized how clever she was, and even going to school as a young girl, she wasn't interested in going to kindergarten. She went to kindergarten for a day or so and pretty much came home and said, that's beneath me. I have no interest in going back to kindergarten, and insisted that she be taken right away to primary school. Oh, wow. And she was always an excellent student and was very curious and just had excellent refined taste, actually, loved Mozart and Beethoven, and at a young age was reading Goethe, reading Faust, and her older siblings loved to enact plays with her. So she had kind of this precocious personality. And then when she was about 14, she takes a break from school. She goes to live with her older sister, Elsa. And they had totally become secularized and stopped living the Jewish faith, which her mother was very, very devout. And this was really kind of stunning for Edith, because she had never seen a family living without God. And it was pretty much a pivotal moment for her. And she'll say that it was then that I stopped praying. But you see that she still has this hunger for truth. So she continues to study, to excel. She's born in Breslau, we had mentioned before, and she goes to the University of Breslau. She then goes to the University of Göttingen and starts off studying psychology, but eventually becomes more and more interested in philosophy. Then the Second World War breaks out. She goes and becomes a Red Cross nurse, and that experience of being a nurse kind of on the front lines will really impact her, certainly her heart, but just her in the intellectual life. She becomes very interested in empathy, and she'll actually write her doctoral dissertation on the problem of empathy and what it is and how it works. She then goes on to study with Edmund Husserl, the founder of phenomenology. So she transfers to the University of Freiburg, where he was teaching. And there it was the first time she started to encounter Christianity and a philosophy that was very conducive to belief in transcendence and belief in God. And there were pretty much sort of 2 major events for Edith that sealed the deal, so to speak. One was during the war, a dear friend of hers, Adolf Reineck, was a philosophy professor, and he's killed on the front lines. And so she goes to comfort his widow and to put his academic papers in order. And what she finds there, his wife Anna, who was a devout Christian, Edith Stein will reflect, it was my first experience of the power of the cross. Oh, wow. And she goes really not knowing, what am I going to say to this woman who will inevitably distraught about the loss of her husband? And what she finds instead was tremendous hope and tremendous peace. The second thing that happened was she was touring the cathedral at Frankfurt with a friend of hers, and growing up Jewish, she had been to services in a synagogue and had Protestant friends who had gone to Protestant services before. But what she saw was a woman with a market basket who was coming in from, just being out shopping and was making a visit to the Blessed Sacrament and stopped to have this intimate conversation with our Lord. And Edith Stein reflected on just what a powerful moment it was for her, that she had never encountered that before, someone stopping into a house of worship, as if someone was really there to talk to, And of course, we know as Catholics there was.
Of course, yep.
And then the last thing that really did it was in the summer of 1921, she's on holiday with some friends on vacation in their home, and her friends were going out for the evening, and they said, make yourself at home in our library. And she picked out an autobiography of Teresa of Avila, the great Carmelite doctor of the church. And she stays up all night reading it, reads the whole book. And in the morning, she declares, this is the truth. And immediately she goes out, she buys a missal and a catechism. She starts attending daily mass. She's baptized January 1st, 1922. Very early on knows that she has a call to Carmel and desire to live as a religious sister, but her spiritual director asks her to wait. So she, I had mentioned, she gets her doctorate in philosophy, but at the time women weren't hired as professors. So she was teaching at a Catholic all-girls school for 10 years, Inspire, with Dominican nuns at a boarding school. And that experience was very formative for her as well, particularly because it got her interested in thinking about a philosophy of woman. What kind of formation would you provide to young girls? How would you help them to discover their dignity as women? How would you form them in their vocation? And the fruits of her time as a teacher is what really brought her to fame in the academic world. She starts lecturing all over Europe to different conferences and giving essays and papers. The Carmelites actually have a wonderful compilation of her essays, and that's where she really develops her philosophy of woman. Then in 1933, Hitler's obviously already come to power. It becomes harder and harder as a Jewish woman to work, and so she decides this is the time to enter. So she enters a Carmel in Cologne in 1934. She makes her first vows in 1935, but eventually the Nazis are just taking over all of Germany, and her sisters decide it's not safe for her as a woman who was born a Jew, even though she's a convert. And so she's transferred to a Carmel in Holland. She and her sister, Rosa, who is also a convert, are there till 1942. In 1942, the Dutch bishops collectively make a statement against Nazism and anti-Semitism, and in retaliation, the Nazis round up every Jewish Catholic convert.
Wow.
So they show up at Carmel on July 2nd, and they take her and her sister Rosa to Westbrook, where they wait for a week to be deported to Auschwitz, and then she's killed pretty much immediately in the gas chambers on August 9th, which is now her feast day.
Yep.
So that's kind of a little bit of her, just her story. But John Paul, in his canonization homily, which is so beautiful, and you see there's such an affinity there. They're both philosophers. John Paul himself had a real interest in phenomenology. They're both students of Max Scheler, a famous phenomenologist. Would talk about how for a long time Edith Stein was a seeker. She walked the arduous path of philosophy with passionate enthusiasm, and she was rewarded. Finally, she was rewarded with what she sought, the truth. And she was seized by it. And John Paul says, rather the truth seized her, and then she discovered that the truth was a person, was Jesus Christ. And I think that's something that makes her story so fascinating, is you see this hunger to know what's true, to ask those deep questions that I think sometimes in our culture we can get so distracted about being entertained and just keeping up with our crazy wild schedules that we don't take the time to do the work of philosophy, to pursue wisdom and to think deeply about the important questions of life. But Edith Stein really calls us to something deeper, to contemplate the transcendent and to cultivate our relationship with our Lord. So that's kind of how I got introduced to her originally, and then a little bit about her life.
That's beautiful. G.K. Chesterton was fond of reflecting on how God gives us the saints we need in the moment, and how they kind of are an antidote to what's ailing society. Do you think Edith Stein is that way for us?
I think that's definitely true. G.K. Chesterton, in his usual way, is so insightful, and you can see it throughout church history. Here's St. Dominic in a period of heresy, and he comes and combats heresy with the truth and a zeal for saving souls by the order of preachers and proclaiming the truth, or St. Francis in a time of sort of lavishness and Assisi, returning us to poverty. So what does Edith Stein have to tell us? I think that so often, especially in the West, we live in a culture that tells women, you will be happiest if you are autonomous, if you have total freedom, freedom from responsibility, freedom from relationships, and that's where your happiness and fulfillment will lie. And here's Edith Stein, who says, no, actually that's contrary to the nature of woman. It's contrary to what it means that we're made for communion. And in a particular, I know we'll talk about this later on in the episode, but Edith Stein, in developing this whole philosophy of women and the understanding of a woman's nature, will say, well, look, she's a philosopher, so we'll start with reason, but we see from scripture, and we see from our human experience from reason, that a woman is, even our bodies bespeak the fact that we're made for communion and we're made to bring forth life. And so a woman's natural disposition is to embrace what is living and whole and personal. And that's such an anecdote to kind of the radical autonomy that our culture holds up to us as, this is really the fulfillment of a woman's nature. This is what's going to bring you ultimate success and happiness. And Edith Stein says, no, actually, that's not the case, because we're made in the image and likeness of God. Well, what is God like? What we know from Revelation is that within the Trinity is a communion of love, of persons. The Father gives himself totally in love to the Son. The Son gives himself totally in love to the Father. And the fruit of this love is the Holy Spirit. And so being made in the image and likeness of God means that we're called to imitate that relationship as closely as possible. And the more we do that, the more authentically human we are, and the happier we'll be, the more we model the Trinity. So what Edith Stein sees so clearly and speaks to so articulately is that a woman is called to love in particular ways. Now, that's not to say that every woman's going to have children, or every woman's going to have a human spouse, right? But that the natural disposition of her soul is to give herself in love and to nurture and guard and protect. You know, you think of even the way a woman's body works. Every woman, regardless of whether or not she'll actually physically bear children, has a space for another, has a capacity to welcome another inside of her. And what Edith Stein attends to is that's not just a biological thing of no significance, right? It bespeaks the disposition of her soul. And Edith Stein really was pretty radical for her. It's not considered radical now, but it was radical for her time, because she would pretty much say, there's no profession that a woman can't do. And some really kind of pushed back on that and contested that idea. And she said, no, any profession is open to should be embraced and open to women, provided that it's not contrary to her nature, provided that it doesn't entail checking your femininity at the door, you know? And in fact, that's the great gift that women bring to the professional life, you know, because it's precisely because of that desire to see the personal and see the human. She's going to be the one who reminds people, look, there's more than a bottom line and a deadline. We have to think about the person. We have to remember their dignity. And so it's not that a woman can't be an engineer or an astronaut or things that are traditionally thought of as being masculine jobs, you know, but it's that women have something great to offer in any sphere of the professional world by being true to their nature, by being true to their dignity, and the particular way that they're called to image the likeness of God in the world. So I think to this kind of false lie that we're so often fed and presented with, that, and it really comes back to kind of, it's an offense against the dignity of the human person. We tend to have this idea of your dignity is based on how useful you are, and what you can do for me. I had this great experience actually when I was leading a Endow group in Manhattan. Manhattan's so fun because it's so diverse, and there's so many women from different cultures and backgrounds. And I had this great Filipino woman who was very impressive. She had been the VP at Chase and was on all sorts of college boards. And we were talking about the tendency when you first meet someone, particularly she was mentioning in America, you ask them, well, what do you do?
Of course, yep.
Right? And part of it is maybe like a little bit of a networking, like, well, what can you do for me? Do you have any connections that I'll be able to utilize at some point? You know, what do you do? I'm trying to put a value on you and what you contribute to society, you know. But she said, in the Philippines, you would never ask someone, what do you do? That's not the first question you ask. So the rest of us who are all Americans were like, incredulous. So, well, what do you ask them in the Philippines? What am I going to get asked? And she said, you ask them two things. One, tell me about your family, and have you eaten?
Really?
Isn't that so fun?
Yeah.
But as we started to unpack that, we realized there was such a beauty to it, because the primary questions are, tell me about your relationships. Tell me about what you love and who you give yourself to. That's your value as a person, right? Yep. Is how you love and who you love. And then how can I serve you? Yep. Not what can you do for me? You've got some great connection, I can work sometime, but how can I affirm your goodness? So if we just act more like men, then we'll be treated with the kind of respect that we deserve to have. In order to be respected and taken seriously, I have to take on masculine qualities, and usually the most unattractive ones.
Women today are not being told that we're beautiful the way that we are, or that our being has dignity or value.
A woman's natural disposition is towards sensitivity, receptivity, maternity, generosity. And we see that in a woman's body.
Jesus is God. Jesus is Lord. Jesus has the victory.
We all have a call to greatness, a desire for it. We want to do something good.
Now is your time. You could change the world, and the world needs changing, so get busy.
Shalom World, God's own channel.
I feel like as women, we're so often told that we're invited into the corporate world if we behave like men, if we compete against men and each other. And that's very contrary to what Edith would say, that we need to bring our gifts to every area of life and society. And that's something that John Paul II says as well, that he gets from her. Tell us a little bit about the connection between John Paul and Edith.
Yeah, I'm gonna hit really quickly that first point you made, Sarah, because I think it's so good. I think that it's interesting, if you study the feminist movement, kind of the first wave of feminism, I think everyone can be on board with. Like, I'm all about being able to vote. I'm all about being able to get an education.
Definitely.
But then there was this funny thing that happened where it's almost like there had been this cultural conversation that said men are better than women. Mm-hmm. And instead of the feminist movement asserting, no, women need to be affirmed for everything that we bring to the table, they bought into the lie and said, you know what, you're right. What men have is more worthwhile. So if we just act more like men, then we'll be treated with the kind of respect that we deserve to have, instead of affirming, no, wait, we don't have to buy into that model. There's something great about complementarity. There's something great about the distinction and goodness that comes out of the complementarity and the distinctiveness and the giftedness that comes with masculinity and femininity. And so unfortunately, what you'll see is a woman feels like, especially a young woman in the professional world, will feel like, in order to be respected and taken seriously, I have to take on masculine qualities, and usually the most unattractive ones, the impatience, the workaholicness, the short temper, the utilitarian viewpoint. I don't have time for you, I'm very busy. This is how important I am.
Getting things done.
Yeah, exactly. Instead of saying, well, wait, I can make time for you. I can make room for you. Persons matter more than really anything else, Mm-hmm. But let's talk about John Paul. So John Paul will talk about in his autobiographies that one of his philosophy professors, Ronan Ingarden, was a contemporary and fellow student with Edith Stein, and he'll pretty much say that it was through Ingarden that he came to know of Edith Stein's philosophy. So John Paul, when he was a philosopher as a seminarian, he studied with Roma Ingarden, who was a contemporary of Edith Stein, and they had been students together. And so his introduction to Edith Stein comes through there. And her essays on women, he'll talk about, were very influential to his own writings on what he'll go on to call the feminine genius. Mm-hmm. And he'll develop in 1988 on the dignity and vocation of women. The previous year, 1987, he had just beatified Edith Stein. Mm-hmm. And you see this, again, we had mentioned earlier, that a woman's natural disposition is towards sensitivity, receptivity, maternity, generosity. And we see that in a woman's body. For people who have studied theology of the body, the basic principle and premise is that man is made in the image and likeness of God, not just in his soul, in his immaterial part, but in his very flesh, like stamped in our very bodies, bespeaks what we're made for. Mm-hmm. So we're made for communion, the fact that men and women fit together in a meaningful way, and that love and communion is meant to be fruitful. That's how new life comes into the world. So John Paul, attending to the same questions that Edith Stein did and lectured on, what is the nature of woman? How is she distinctive from a man? What can we say about masculinity and femininity, their complementarity? And then what is her vocation? How is she called to live a life of love, live a life of communion? And so going back to that quote of Edith Stein, that a woman's natural disposition is to embrace what is living, personal, and whole. It's not to say that women can't do abstraction, so to speak. Edith Stein herself is a philosopher. She does abstraction. Yeah. But it's to say that a woman's not content to just stay in her head. She wants to engage her heart. She engages things in a whole and holistic way. And I think most women have a common experience of this. The way that women engage friendship is very intimate. It's very personal. The whole quote of, walk a mile in someone else's shoes. Women are very good at empathy. We're very good at commiserating together and taking on one another's suffering. So that's sort of her philosophy of women becomes developed, certainly out of her experience of forming young girls, high school girls, and being present to them as their teacher. But then giving these lectures, she would have to prepare and think about, well, how are women called to live out their dignity in the world? What do they bring to society? What do they bring to the national life? What do they bring to family life? Edith Stein was very attentive to, especially a woman called to marriage and motherhood, that she was the heart of the home, and making it, and her disposition towards the other, towards the personal, wasn't meant just for her primary relationships, for her husband and her children, but it was meant to extend much more broadly. So, a woman who mentors a junior colleague, a woman who cares for aging parents, a woman who, is caring for a best friend going through a hard time. Those are all expressions of kind of spiritual motherhood, that desire to guard and protect and nourish, not in a selfish, possessive way. I think we've probably unfortunately all had experience of mothers, who are too possessive, and their children don't flourish because of that. But a woman rather is called to encourage. And really, if the life of Edith Stein, you see that her own mother, I think, was really the epitome of this sort of woman. Her mother obviously had many children, but she was kind of known in the neighborhood for taking other people's children inside. Everyone wanted to be at the Stein house. It was a place of joy and beautiful art and beautiful music, and her mother really was the focal point in creating that kind of culture in her home. And so getting back to your original question, the original kind of link between Edith Stein and John Paul comes through Roman Garden, and then through his own writings on women, his Angelus addresses, then his letter to women in response to the UN convention that was going to go on in Beijing, and thinking about just the particular gift that women are. So Edith Stein has this great quote where she says, "The world doesn't need what women do so much as it needs what women are."
Yeah.
And you see that emblematically in John Paul, where he starts off letter to women saying, "Thank you, women who are mothers. You are the loving face that a child first beholds. Mm-hmm. Thank you, women who are daughters. Thank you, women who are sisters. Thank you, women who work." And he goes through this whole list of thank yous. It's like he's trying to cover all of his bases.
Yeah.
And then he gets to the very end and he says, "Thank you, every woman, for being a woman." It's not so much, again, we were talking about earlier, like our culture tends to say like your value lies in being productive and what you do or what you do for me. But John Paul says, no, it's your being. It's in virtue of your very nature, the very way that you embody the beauty and goodness of God himself through your femininity. That's what the world needs. Yeah. The world needs who you are. And I think that the two are so, in many ways, have a very similar heart. John Paul had a very Carmelite heart. He studied John of the Cross, and Edith Stein's kind of dying, the work she was working on as before the Nazis come to get her. Actually, her Carmelite sisters find this floor of her room after she's been taken out by the Gestapo. Was a commentary and analysis of the writings of John of the Cross, the kind of famous Carmelite. And John Paul had written his dissertation at the Angelicum on John of the Cross. And so I think you see a kind of fraternal joy. If you read the canonization homily for Edith Stein, you see a real sort of kinship between the two. They're both philosophers. They both have this love for the truth. He brings her up when he writes Fides et Ratio, John Paul's encyclical on faith and reason. He talks about modern philosophers who do Catholic philosophy well. He mentions Edith Stein. And you see how she was just an embodiment of what John Paul talks about. In the beginning of Fides et Ratio, John Paul will say, God has placed within the human heart a desire to know the truth, in a word, himself. That desire for truth, that hunger to know and understand, is all rooted in the fact that Christ is the truth. And so I think she was he'll even admit, was very foundational for him in terms of developing his own thinking and philosophy of woman.
So beautiful. And I think, women today are not being told that we're beautiful the way that we are, or that our being has dignity or value. We are so often told that we are only what we are worth. And it's beautiful for him to affirm that we have dignity, not based on any of the world's standards, but because we're made in God's image. And to invite us to bring that to the world is a beautiful thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think it's beautiful. You said that most of us will not be called to martyrdom, to lay down our lives the way that Edith did in Auschwitz. But leading up to that, she was still such a great witness of redemptive suffering and understanding the cost of pursuing truth and doing it with charity. Because in her pursuit of truth, she always kept in mind her mother, even though she knew she was called to become Catholic and then a Carmelite nun. She didn't do it to annoy her mom or to dismiss her mom at all. It was always done with such charity that she knew it was a hardship for her mother to have this happen, and she was patient with her and followed God's call for her, but not in a way that dismissed her mother's suffering through it. And I think that's a beautiful example that we are often going to be called to do something that's hard, and the people around us might not understand it, might not see that we're doing what God's asking us. And when that happens, to respond as Edith did, that to follow God and to love charitably the people around us and help them understand His will.
So there's this great quote from the Second Vatican Council from Gaudium et Spes that says, "Man cannot truly discover himself except through a sincere gift of self." And it's so countercultural. You know, we hold up to young women that your value lies in being seductive or being productive. Like, show me how accomplished you are or show me how sexy you are, right? What you can do for me, how you can pleasure a man or how you're being wildly successful. Preferably do both, you know?
Of course.
But the reality that we can't truly be fulfilled and truly know who we are except in love, except in giving ourselves, except in communion. Because again, that's the reality of the Trinity. And being made in the image and likeness of God, that's how we'll authentically be who we were created to be. And Edith Stein sees that so clearly and so articulately. So I think she really is just such a woman for our times and knows the difficulties of being a modern woman, but so eloquently lived the truth of the gospel in the midst of our modern times and in the midst of great personal suffering and persecution, that she can really be a model for all of us who are trying to authentically live our femininity and fidelity to the truths of our faith.
Yeah. And I think it's true. She is such a beautiful witness, and we're so blessed in the Catholic Church to have the communion of saints, sisters and brothers who we can look to, who have done the walk, who have made the journey, and we can learn so much from them to continue to grow and walk ourselves towards Christ, which is the ultimate goal. And so I think it's been beautiful to spend this time talking with you, Emily, about Edith Stein and the way that she has impacted you and me in my own life. And I just hope that the women out there have learned something about Edith, and if they're interested in learning more, I recommend learning more about Edith. Just Google her. There's so much. St. Teresa Benedict of the Cross. Her writings are beautiful on the feminine genius. And so it's been great to have you here. Thank you, Emily.
Thank you for having me. It was such a joy to be with you, Sarah.